Immersion, or the ability of a piece of media to make the audience invest their attention into and suspend their disbelief towards a fictional world, is a familiar concept when it comes to thinking about narrative mediums. A story told through text may achieve a sense of immersion through detailed descriptions in prose, or characters and dialogue that feel like they could be real. Movies and other visual mediums introduce a visual aspect that usually directly reflects some sense of reality, which will inherently foster a base level of immersion in the audience that can be further built upon. But it should also be clear to see that video games are capable of taking these base levels of immersion one step further. Whereas the events depicted in a story told through text or film are rigid and unchanging, the nature of video games as an interactive medium introduces some degree of agency that can reflect the sort of agency we have in real life, which is a powerful tool that can create very immersive experiences. But an important caveat here is that immersion comes in degrees, and especially in the context of video games, it comes from many different features of a work. Not all pieces of media will be occupied with cultivating a suspension of disbelief in the audience, but for those whose success hinges on that suspension of disbelief, there are many different ways that immersion can be cultivated. What I've realized from playing everything from small, low production value indie games to sprawling big budget AAA games is that the sense of immersion that many games want to achieve doesn't necessarily require the big budgets and high production values of those AAA games. In fact, some of the most immersive experiences I've come across in my time playing games have been ones that are incredibly simple both mechanically and visually, but those games apply some clever tricks to achieve that immersion. This video is all about those tricks and other elements of game design that help strengthen the immersive tie between the player and the game, as well as the games that manage to build that immersion despite not existing on the cutting edge of visual fidelity. So let's get into that. Before getting into those design tricks, I do think it's important to quickly go over those techniques that aren't strictly tied to interactivity, which generally function in the same way they do for non-interactive mediums. When video games employ traditional narrative techniques, meaning those techniques that don't involve interactivity, aspects like believable dialogue between characters and internal consistency in world building are just as important as they are in books and movies. An important aside here is that these aspects of the narrative don't necessarily need to reflect our reality, they only need to reflect a believable reality, which is why I want to emphasize both internal and external consistency. Internal consistency is simply consistency within a specific fictional world, whereas external consistency is consistency with a different world, which is typically the real world that we live in. Fantasy or science fiction worlds are not totally externally consistent with the real world with respect to systems of magic or fictional scientific concepts, but as long as their worlds are internally consistent, these fictional worlds can be believable despite not being realistic. There is a point where external consistency is practically necessary, however, which is why the vast majority of stories at least aim to have characters whose actions conform to human psychology. This is because characters showing human emotions and having reasonable, rational reactions to events in the story makes those characters feel more real and believable in a way that is far more difficult for us to suspend our disbelief about when that external consistency is absent. For an example of this, Oblivion is a game that is famous for its character AI and the transparently artificial, totally irrational reactions they have to the emergent situations the player can place them in. While this gives the game a very unique comedic tone that is very entertaining, that comes at the expense of immersion, which is a result of the external consistency of character interactions being poor, and not because of the Elder Scrolls universe's fantasy elements. Aside from these narrative elements, visuals and audio design are also traditional elements of media that most video games have, and they're also the elements that are most intuitive in their contribution to immersion. In the modern day, with the highly sophisticated graphics technology we have at our disposal, even relatively small teams are capable of making games that approach photorealism in their graphical fidelity, though there are still big-budget AAA releases that reach close to the limits of what's possible with the current constraints of our technology. For many years following the inception of video games, the minor narrative elements that could fit within the technical limitations of cartridge sizes were only backed up by abstract clumps of pixels and totally synthesized, simplistic audio that represented the characters and environments. While I'll be getting into how immersion can still be drawn out of more primitive games like this, there's no doubt that modern technology has allowed games to more closely mimic the range of emotions that live-action movies are capable of evoking through their reflection of reality, which is important to acknowledge as a valid source of immersion. However, I'd also like to acknowledge the dangers of relying solely on visuals for immersion, as the nature of how video games are constructed makes it easy for this sort of immersion to be broken. In the same way that a well-written story can be significantly worsened by a single contrivance or out-of-character moment, the immersion derived from realistic visuals can be significantly impacted by a single unintentional graphical hiccup. This sort of visual inconsistency could show up in other visual mediums like movies, but movies don't have to account for the agency the audience has in video games, so a director only needs to account for anything in the camera's field of view rather than entire virtual environments. When interactivity is introduced, especially alongside the very large and complex games of today, using a ton of middleware that developers don't necessarily have the ability to debug and change, these errors can easily pop up in edge cases or obscure corners of the game world that very few players will find. Minor visual inconsistencies like strange animations or physics bugs are especially pervasive in big AAA games, and if you happen to run into them, they can take away from the illusion of a living, realistic world that many of these games aim to achieve. So with all that in mind, I'd now like to get into the techniques that are totally unique to the interactive medium, which obviously all stem from the interactivity that video games provide their players. Immersion comes from many different places in a piece of media, but the most obvious place I've been focusing on thus far arises from conforming to how the audience sees and experiences reality. Video games have a leg up on other mediums when it comes to this, thanks to their interactive nature, though there are still a few case studies I'd like to go over that push the boundaries of immersion through their design. I'll start off with some more well-known examples, starting with a staple of immersive design in games, the Half-Life series. The sense of immersion that the Half-Life games evoke has been refined over the series' lifetime, but the design tricks they employ have largely stayed the same since its first incarnation from over 25 years ago. In 1998, computers couldn't handle complex 3D graphics like real-time lighting or physically based rendering, which meant that Half-Life was very limited in how well it could mimic reality in terms of visuals. The later games in the series would push the graphical fidelity further and build a heightened sense of immersion through that, but the first game was unable to take advantage of these due to those technical limitations. However, Half-Life was still able to establish itself as one of the most immersive games ever made at the time of its release, through two very important design decisions that intertwine with a few critical narrative decisions. The Gold Source engine that Half-Life was made with is built upon the id Tech engine used to make Quake, as id has been a company known for their groundbreaking first-person shooter games ever since Doom released in 1993. The first-person perspective wasn't a new thing for video games when Half-Life released, but Half-Life did uniquely demonstrate the immersive feel the perspective can provide. When it comes to reflecting reality and the human condition in the presentation of a piece of media, the first-person perspective is arguably the ideal perspective to experience a story from, because it most accurately reflects how we experience the real world at all times. Although Doom, and especially the fully 3D Quake, were a step up from the 2D visuals and abstract perspectives that nearly all games adopted before them, they were still very much held back with respect to immersion by their arcadey, gameplay-first design philosophies. New weapons are found as abstract floating pickups, enemies exist solely as mechanical elements to be torn through on the way to an end goal, and every strictly segmented level ends with a congratulatory screen that breaks down your performance as a player. Half-Life took the immersive first-person perspective from Quake and did away with those arcadey elements, all while introducing another design choice that pushed Half-Life beyond any other game at the time of its release. On top of being radically committed to never leaving the point of view of Gordon Freeman, Half-Life also almost never takes control away from the player. Not only does all gameplay take place in the first-person perspective, just like Doom or Quake, but control isn't even taken away during most narrative sections, particularly those at the beginning of the game where the story's conflict is set up. The player is free to walk around the Black Mesa facility and interact with the scientists and security guards in a totally non-directed way, which carries a much greater sense of immersion than Doom and Quake's text dumps, or even taking control away from the player for cutscenes. This is in part because agency is another part of the human condition that video games are able to reflect through their interactive nature, which is a power that Half-Life understood and heavily capitalized on. Of course, Half-Life's narrative also lends itself to this goal of maximizing immersion, which starts with Gordon Freeman's role as the silent protagonist. While this decision would end up being quite awkward if the camera was to leave Gordon's perspective periodically, or if the entire story was told in a traditional, non-interactive medium, Gordon instead becomes a clean slate that the player is in full control of at all times, allowing the player to fully project themselves onto their player character and place themselves in Gordon's situation more easily. Additionally, Half-Life's introductory train ride was also quite avant-garde for video games in 1998, especially for FPS games. Narrative elements in video games were taken much less seriously at the time of Half-Life's release when compared to the present day, so this 5-minute stretch at the very beginning of the game where no gameplay or exciting set pieces presented was a legitimately risky decision. Instead of jumping straight into the excitement of the oncoming alien invasion, the first-person perspective and control afforded to the player are leveraged to create a moment that shows the game's setting in its banal form, with Gordon going to work just like any other day on the job. Showing the juxtaposition between the facility in working order and its state following the residence cascade makes Black Mesa feel like a real place, which is only enhanced by the game's design choices that round out Half-Life as a landmark achievement in immersive design. Despite how revolutionary Half-Life was in terms of immersion, the games industry has had over 25 years since its release to innovate upon not just graphics technology, but also to innovate upon the design that made the game so immersive. For all the design tricks it employs that derive from player agency, Half-Life is still a very linear, directed experience, where every moment of gameplay is silently guided by the developers. On the other hand, there's an entire genre that typically shares many elements with Half-Life while introducing a heightened level of agency that can enhance immersion further: the immersive sim. To explain what exactly makes immersive sims so immersive, I'm first going to talk about interactivity at a fundamental level. By definition, every video game in existence implements interactivity in some way, even if it's just through a very simple control scheme or choosing branching paths in a visual novel. The vast majority of games past those with very basic interactivity introduce systems that provide a challenge by introducing obstacles to player progress. Of these games, you can categorize them by positioning them along two gradients: how much freedom they allow in what order you tackle obstacles, and how much freedom they allow in how exactly you tackle those obstacles. There are games that are both very linear and very restrictive of how many viable methods are available to the player, and there are also games that are very freeing in either where the player wants to go or how many options and tools the player has. Immersive sims derive their immersive quality from their commitment to player freedom, which puts them on the high end of both gradients. Even if individual levels are moved through linearly, immersive sims allow the player freedom to decide where in these levels they want to explore by offering many branching paths with tantalizing gameplay and narrative rewards waiting for those who explore diligently. But more importantly, immersive sims allow the player freedom to choose how exactly they deal with obstacles, and in a broader sense how they interact with the environment. These games typically take place within a specific set of environments that are made up of a specific set of gameplay elements, and the player is given a wide variety of tools they can use to interact with those elements. Those tools often take the form of an arsenal of weapons, abilities that use a replenishable mana-like resource, object manipulation with physics engines, or sets of items that can be used with specific objects. To give a brief case study in this design philosophy, Prey is one of the more open-ended immersive sims that also gives a wide breadth of possibilities for how the player can deal with obstacles. For example, locked doors or otherwise blocked passageways are a staple of immersive sim environments, and the best games of this genre give each of these obstacles genuine alternatives to the most basic method that require varying degrees of creativity to discover. In Prey, you can search the environment for a keycard or a 4-digit code, or if the door is locked by a keypad, you can invest in the hacking skill that allows you to gain access to keypads without entering the code. If the room you're trying to enter has a breakable window, then that can act as another entry method, even if the space you would have to fit through is too small if you invest in the mimic ability. Many rooms are also connected to vent systems, which act as rewards for exploring every corner of the levels for hidden alternative paths. If a doorway is blocked by heavy objects, you could use a recycler charge to clear the objects out of the way, or you could invest in the leverage ability to simply pick up the objects. The Huntress Boltcaster is another inventive tool that can interact with the touchscreen monitors found throughout the game, some of which will open locked doors. Of course, this is all on top of the glue gun, which can create small climbable platforms on walls, allowing for unmatched freedom and level traversal when given enough skill and ingenuity. As I've said several times before in this video, agency is a part of the human condition that video games are uniquely capable of reflecting, and immersive sims are specifically designed to provide the player with a large degree of agency in how they play the game. Ideally, the result of this breadth of interaction with the world is that the player is instilled with the sense that their interactions with the environment carry weight, and that whichever interaction they choose in any given situation will provide a satisfying, sensible payoff. Aside from the entertainment value that experimentation with these mechanics can provide, this is also where the immersive sim derives its immersion from, as accounting for every possible way the player can interact with the complex web of game systems will result in an environment that feels reactive and believable. Of course, the more believable the game's world is, the more easily players will be immersed in that world, which is why the best immersive sims tend to be as immersive as their namesake would imply. While immersive sims represent immersion that arises from putting player expression and a highly interactive environment first, there's another source of immersion that arguably arises from the opposite philosophy. Subtracting design is a design philosophy pioneered by the developers of Ico, which is all about removing as many mechanics that exist within the periphery of a game's main focus, with the intent of focusing in on a very specific experience. The application of this philosophy in the development of Ico resulted in the removal of things like HUD UI elements, player health and combat, and any significant verbal communication between the two main characters, all in service of focusing in on the endearing silent relationship between those two main characters and the attachment you feel to them as the player. Other games that employ this philosophy include what are derisively called walking simulators, which strip out the typical shooter combat from the first-person shooter in order to tell specific stories that don't necessarily invoke violence. Earlier in this video, I briefly mentioned the concept of arcadey aspects of design, which I would specifically define as the tropes that arose from the gameplay-first design philosophy that the games industry was built upon in its infancy due to technical limitations. In the context of designing for immersion, these tropes often serve to pull the player out of the experience by acting as reminders of the game's artificial nature. Since the ultimate goal of immersive design is to allow the player to forget about the real world and place themselves into a fictional world, those aspects that feel distinctly video gamey will work against that goal. Subtracting design is a useful concept here, as in the pursuit of more immersive experiences, we can work to remove as many video game tropes that work against immersion. The aforementioned walking simulators are good examples of this process in action, but there's an even more clear-cut case study that is even more radical in its rejection of conventional gameplay, which is a game called Proteus. Proteus is a game that became infamous around the time of its release for not really being a game. Although I'm happy to categorize it as a game, it does lean more into being an experimental, interactive art piece, more so than what we would traditionally call a video game. The only thing that could possibly be construed as video gamey about Proteus is the first-person control scheme it adopts, but past the bare essentials of player control and basic interactivity, it's a game that's committed to rejecting such common aspects of game design like goals or challenge. After the title screen, there is no UI, no text or traditional narrative of any kind, and you are given no direction as a player. You are simply left to observe the island you find yourself on. The visuals are simple and very low fidelity, but also quite striking, with an audio system that procedurally adds to the music depending on what part of the world you're around or interacting with, which makes the environments very enjoyable to simply walk around and experience. I thought about what the most immersive game I've ever played is while writing the script for this video, and I came to the surprising conclusion that Proteus might take that top spot, which is almost entirely in virtue of its simplicity and design. It's such a unique game in this way that I can really only compare the feelings it left me with to one other game, and only at a very specific time in my life that I played it, which is the first time I played Minecraft when I was in elementary school. When you've played video games for decades like I have, you start to understand them as closed, relatively deterministic systems that you can manipulate to your liking as a player given enough experience. Fights in action games become timing windows and damage numbers, RPGs become min-maxing statistics problems, and puzzles become rigid sets of rules with inputs and outputs. When you start to think about games in this way, their ability to immerse you into these worlds is significantly dampened, as it becomes difficult to think about them outside their existence as mechanics born from code running on a computer. But as a kid, I didn't think about games in this way simply because of my lack of experience, which made Minecraft in particular a very special experience for me. Because of how much I've played this game now, I could blast through a hardcore playthrough if I dedicate myself to it for an entire day, but the sense of mystery and discovery provided by the procedurally generated worlds, and my childlike interest in just existing within a virtual world rather than progressing in it, made Minecraft unlike any other game I had ever played at that point in my life. I didn't think I would ever be content to simply exist within a game's world ever again, but Proteus's rejection of goals and milestones in favor of the simple joy of observation brought me back to that simpler time. For someone like me who has spent nearly all their life playing video games, that's a feeling that can only truly be evoked by significantly deviating from convention and giving the player nothing to do but aimlessly wander, and that urge to simply exist rather than progress is one that is highly conducive to immersion. I know this game is divisive, and I understand why some people don't like it, but this is what made Proteus's design so immersive in my eyes, and it's why I consider it a truly immersive experience. There is one more technique I would like to talk about, and I saved this one for last since it relates to a very specific type of narrative that is essentially unique to the interactive medium. Traditional forms of media have a very specific sort of relationship with their audience, where the audience is only observing and not participating in the stories they tell. Video games are different, as introducing interactivity necessarily produces a different sort of relationship, one where the player has some level of control over the game's outcome. Although this relationship was certainly acknowledged by many games over the years, it began to be more thoroughly explored by the AAA industry, at first by games like Metal Gear Solid and its sequels, as well as in much later releases like Spec Ops: The Line. But these sorts of self-aware stories, which I'll call meta-narratives, have been embraced by the indie scene following the Xbox Live Arcade boom, which has resulted in what I consider to be some of the most powerful stories told through games. I think this narrative style has been more attractive to indie developers because of its potential to compensate for other areas of indie games that may be lacking compared to AAA releases, specifically when it comes to immersion. Particularly at the start of the indie boom, indie games weren't capable of matching AAA quality graphics, so they didn't have that aspect that could help build immersion. However, all the design tricks I've been talking about are readily available for anyone to use, regardless of how much money they have to spend or how skilled they are at creating photorealistic environments. Additionally, with respect to how a strong story and writing can contribute to immersion, video games are uniquely suited to benefiting from meta-narratives because of the unique relationship between player and game. Specifically for single-player games, this relationship is mutual in terms of how each party can interact with the other, which stands in contrast to traditional media where the audience has no ability to interact with the story. Since the player can be given agency over a game, they can essentially be cast as a character within the game's narrative, which is a powerful tool for creating an immersive experience. Players will typically project their own reactions and feelings onto the characters they control in games, but the meta-narrative offers the opportunity for the player to participate in a distinctly more direct way that allows for a higher level of immersion. This is especially useful for indie games because it can essentially offset what's lost in terms of immersion due to low-fidelity visuals, and even go beyond what visuals alone can do if that visual style is contextualized by the narrative. Although I'll stand by Proteus being the peak of immersion I've ever experienced in a game, games like One Shot come very close while providing a thought-provoking narrative that the player directly participates in. This is in spite of the game's very simplistic visuals, but that lack of fidelity essentially becomes irrelevant when the game's entire narrative is specifically set up to immerse the player in their role as themselves, a person from a different world interacting with a computer program. These sorts of games also tend to employ techniques that imitate the operating system of your device or interact with it in unconventional ways, which can add another layer of immersion, as if something abnormal is really taking place on your machine. Thanks to the asymmetrical relationship between player and game, where the game dictates what is and isn't possible within its own closed system, a game can essentially feign self-awareness by accounting for every possible choice the player can make and acting as such. While stories of artificial consciousness and self-aware computers have been told quite effectively through traditional means, there's a uniquely immersive experience to be had from actually interacting with the illusion of one, which is indicative of the power of interactivity in general. Meta-narratives have created some of my favorite experiences playing games, in part because of how immersive and emotionally powerful they can be when done right, but also because of how unique they are to this medium. It's a reminder, among the other design tricks I've gone over, of the unique powers that interactive experiences can have, either when telling a story or just providing a non-directed, open-ended experience. But the larger point I'm trying to get at with this video is that video games are capable of being immersive without the big budgets and high production values that come along with AAA productions, which can even be a hindrance in many cases. When it comes to designing an immersive experience around interactivity, making the player's interactions with the game and its story satisfying and believable is of overriding importance when compared to the goal of achieving photorealism or otherwise improving graphical fidelity, which is a claim that I've hopefully given some reason to believe here. And especially now that independent developers have access to a much wider breadth of tools that are capable of matching AAA visual fidelity in some cases, I'm excited to see what immersive experiences developers will come up with next.